Firstly, always acknowledgement to country. I always love coming this way because it's such a beautiful country that has been taken care of by our old people forever, and under duress we're still standing. We're still standing strong in our Aboriginal being, as illustrated by our elder today, who so graciously and kindly welcomed us yet again to country. So I'm thankful for that. Thank you for the welcome to country. Acknowledgement to all other First Nations peoples who have across the continent that we now call Australia. I'm always happy to travel and talk and meet with other people. So acknowledgement to all other First Nations here today. Acknowledgement to the organisers to bring this event together. I know how hard it is to bring events such as this, marginal events such as this that are on the periphery and are not so well resourced. So special acknowledgements for that fact, and I appreciate the effort and the endeavour to bring an event such as this together today. So sadly lacking, and it's wonderful to see Western Sydney taking the initiative and leading in this space. It's one that all other universities across this continent should be following and picking up and addressing more broadly and collaborating and working more strongly together. So I hope that's a vision that we can put out there for the future. Acknowledgement to all other speakers and our other key presenter today. I'm very happy to share discussion with you today. I look forward to it. And all of the other speakers as well. I look forward to the discussions and the sharing of knowledges, and to see how far we can travel today in advancing the discussion and the discourse. Not only just advancing the discussion, but always more importantly looking to the implementation and the desperate critical action that needs to happen and needs to come from these discursive spaces. So to be always mindful that the action is critical. So I just wanted, I thought actually I was going to go second, so that's okay. I'll just retweak as I go. By way of introduction, and I'm going to read a paper, I'm not going to run through PowerPoints. So if you can bear with me just to sort of set the scene. And by way of introduction, for many of us, I'm just repeating to the converted much of what we already know. That for First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, the matrix of colonial power remains a fixture on our territories, and that colonial violence has never ended, and that's a clear fact. This is the cruel and the inhumane, the ongoing colonial project, one that impacts all peoples, and my focus here is on Aboriginal peoples and the effect of colonialism upon our core relational being and our capacity to hold a centre that connects to our Aboriginal worlds, and now post-1788, all other peoples who have come to our territories as either invading, settler colonial, immigrant, slave or refugee. The focus of my work has been to understand how the disruption of our ancient Aboriginal ways of living and the relationships that are foundational to that way of being were dragged into what we now call modernity, where we now physically survive on the periphery but retain a centre of authority, as we have forever, while the colonial power in opposition works to disappear and marginalise our very Aboriginal being. So dragged by the forces of colonialism, imperialism, and delegitimised by the myth of white supremacy, the doctrine of terra nullius, the lands that belong to nobody, its meaning in international law, ensured that our lands became sites where acts of violence were sanctioned and violence was deemed a necessary part of the civilising missions by the conquerors, intent upon saying saving the natives from our very native selves. In Australia, it was widespread, and essentially it was acts of violence which founded the Australian colonial state. And I've recently submitted, if you access the UN CERD site and you look at the review of Australia in November, there's a paper, a submission from the nations of Australia where we've submitted these very arguments, and you may, for those students of international law or with an interest in this area, may find a paper worth reading. It was a collaborative effort that follows some of the work that the Canadians have, Canadian First Nations peoples had made in their submissions to CERD in August of last year as well. Could I just get a glass of water? Yeah, thanks. There was no intention to make a meeting of First Nations peoples as per the colonial project, an agreement or a relationship between First Nations, I think, and the invader, but rather to eradicate the savage by force of arms and to then gather the survivors onto missions to become civilised and ultimately assimilated into a slave-like identity. Our ancestors were intended to become a future workforce for the new colonies, and this occurred. Our ancestors experienced a violent colonial frontier, and this body of violence has been translated into and legitimised and authorised, although I'd say it's not by authority but by power, as the fundamental underpinnings of colonial law. So violence is the foundation of the colonial legal system and remains the foundation of Australian law. The history of the power and force of Australian colonialism fits well with the argument that the origins of law are in violence, an argument that was mooted by Walter Benjamin and taken up by a major piece by Derrida in A Force of Law, his piece on the force of law, the mystical foundation of authority. However, I make a point of distinction here in terms of I don't view this notion as being universal, that there's a universal underpinning of law being based on and its origins being set in violence. That is, that same theory doesn't concern the origins of First Nations laws. Our laws are known to us as being of the land and of the natural world, which we exist within. Relationality is at the core of our being, and we know of ourselves in relation to all things in our natural world. So the law constitutes our relationship to all that we live with. It is important to distinguish universal ideas of law's originary violence and to distinguish the ancient legal systems of Australia from that notion of a universal force of law, to one localised by our elders, to a law of the land, not of a force, but of a knowledge and a will in the law. I think it's important that we make these distinctions and we refute these universal notions of law being underpinned by an original violence. So I think that as colonised peoples, we share that experience of the violence of a colonial legal system. But all of those experiences are not the same, and I think that there's a real difference in terms of the experiences and the ongoing experiences of Aboriginal peoples, of First Nations peoples. Colonialism's military power became legitimised as law, and that law became deemed to be a universal, as though no other way of being lawful is known to the world. The laws of the colonising states have been taken up as being of a universal application, and thus laws founded in violence were legitimised in both the colonially constructed domestic law, but also in international laws. So that is that both domestic and international jurisprudence is rooted and founded in a colonial violence. Derrida wrote on law as though its acknowledged origins were a universal phenomenon, again, as I've previously said, but they're not. For First Nations had and still have a way, not violence founded, but lawful. However, while the power of the colonisers has framed and constructed itself as being law, the laws of the afflicted First Nations have been portrayed as non-existent, but as we know, our Aboriginal being exists, and that is our greatest challenge, to be in our own authority, to continue standing in our own Aboriginal being. So for First Nations, no law differently. The laws of First Nations originating from the language of my ancestors, the Tanganakau peoples of the Coorong, what we called Kaudoinuri, what whitefellas call the dream time. Kaudoinuri is a place of lawfulness, of where the law come to be, that where peoples understand a lawful way or a proper way of being. You talk to many elders, and if you listen long enough and hard enough and listen properly, at the end of the roundabout of many of those conversations comes out of it that in whatever event we have to do things properly, we have to do things lawfully, we have to do things in a proper Aboriginal way. So Kaudoinuri is a place of the creation of our songs which record the time of the first sunrise, and more commonly and more badly translated, as I've previously mentioned, as the dream time. So this whole thing of translation of language is important, and the sovereignty of us becoming again in our languages is so critical for us to, in terms of centering Aboriginal worlds and centering our own philosophical understandings of who we are. I want to look at the idea of civilising natives. In Australia, civilising missions have occurred since 1788, and the British invasion of New South Wales was one to save the native from the native self. The colonisers are still at it, but the civilising missions are now known as human rights interventions of the state. Armed with the idea that they are enacted in the best interests of Aboriginal peoples, they continue to this day to enable the processes of colonialism, and one example is the ongoing Commonwealth Northern Territory emergency response to the construction of Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal First Nations peoples, as being so incapacitated that their lives were in demand of a human rights intervention in the face of the Northern Territory emergency response laws. So this is one example of what I mean by the contemporary colonialism in the face of what we call or translate from a neoliberal framework as human rights. I argue that there was always and continues to this day to be a vested interest in keeping the colonial project alive, and that is why the events such as those called as human rights interventions, they will continue to be enacted so as to retain colonial hierarchies of power, to act and control within neoliberal frameworks. So it's a particular space that in terms of action that we need to monitor, and we need the critical discourse needs to be as it is, but it continues to need to engage in this discourse of human rights, and human rights for who, and within what framework, what kinds of human rights, and this notion of universal human rights. So it's a space that we need to continue to monitor. How does human rights sit? I mean, my work has always emanated from the space of the rights of peoples, and that's a different concept to human rights. It's one that embraces the thinking of decolonisation and the rights of peoples to self-determination, which is a different platform to what we're talking about in terms of human rights. We're talking about Aboriginal people's rights to self-determination, the right to territorial integrity, and not a simple focus on a human rights framework which is picking up one piece of the puzzle after another and trying to piece together a construct of the human. But the critical question for us is in what frame are we repiecing together the puzzle of the human, and what is that going to look like in the future? I understand the call to this symposium was in consideration of critical race studies in Australia. However, my work has largely focused on colonial foundation and its denial of an Aboriginal experience. So it's in thinking about how that intersects, or how we work together, based upon, and it's clear, it's based upon, as Alana introduced, the notion, the racist doctrine of terra nullius. So my work is largely a critique of colonisation and its manifestation of colonial legal systems. In thinking race, the foundation of the Australian state is based upon a colonial foundation which has negated the life of hundreds of First Nations while committing the denied crime of genocide. So from that platform, human rights doesn't get us to be able to critically unpack questions of self-determination and genocide as they are crimes against peoples. A foundation drawn from the power of the colonial project denying the ancient and lawful authority of ancient nations. I want to say that critical race studies, or black studies, are what comes out of colonialism as a talking back space from the standpoint of race and its study of. To understand the complexities of colonialism, we need to see the source of its foundation and how it constitutes itself. So those two questions, I think, are paramount. How it constitutes itself as the impossible matrix of an unbreakable power. And I think that's the thing, that the impossibility of colonialism, or of it constructing itself as a matrix of an impossibility, an unbreakable frame. So this to examine critically the posturing or positioning of human rights within that space. In advancing a dialogue, we need to understand how players within this colonial matrix contribute to the ongoing project of colonialism itself, and the illusion that that is all there is, the colonial matrix itself. And that the impossibility of another way or horizon is just that, an impossibility. I've, in my work in raw law, have had that conversation between Aboriginal legal systems and the colonial legal system to argue and put forward that there is another horizon. There's in fact been another horizon on this continent forever, for more than 60,000 years, and it's still ongoing. And as Mary Graham has always said so eloquently, we have managed this continent forever, and under duress we still manage this country today. Very becoming that it comes from women. And the impossibility of another way or horizon, I would argue, has always exists and continues to coexist under the duress of colonialism. This is even though in this continent Aboriginal people have been managing in relationship with the natural world or lives since the first sunrise. We have always been here as nations of peoples, and this is in contradiction to the colonial principle of terra nullius itself. Another horizon predates colonialism and continues to exist under the lies of terra nullius. Now to thinking about relationality. In talking about relationality, there is a difference in how I deploy relationality as a way of being in the world, and which I've written about in my book, Raw Law. Many First Nations peoples have different knowledges of the origin of law. We know that law is everywhere in the land and the natural world. We are belonging to and surrounded by law. We are in relationships with law, and all of those relationships are by humans as beings of law. and all living things are beings of law. Law's subject is inclusive of all things in the natural world. It is not limited to the human. The laws of the colonial states are hierarchical and understand life forms as being of property and not of themselves. Breaches of First Nations law occur on a daily basis within colonial states in the form of environmental degradation, acts of genocide, and acts of genocide in the form of the removal of our children from their families and communities, to a point that the current removal rates of Aboriginal children across this continent at this moment in time now is greater than it has ever been in any other time in the history of the colonisation of this continent. Assimilation policies and cruel and inhumane punishments as a result of the over-imprisonment of Aboriginal peoples, all of which challenges the core of relationality from an Aboriginal perspective. So just in that sense, what is being imposed on Aboriginal peoples is never constructed as an actual breach of Aboriginal peoples' rights as peoples, but that it's a breach of Aboriginal law itself. Colonial power, known as law framing all citizens of its power, its constructed regulations are sourced in the violence of the colonial project itself, and it is a thing which has been legitimised and maintained by its own inherent violence. So we ask the simple question, how then could this be law? Aboriginal peoples, as I've said over and over again, know law differently. So how might we know other ways of knowing the law when the power and force of colonialism annihilates all that is different and lawful concepts such as relationality and reciprocity in particular? As a First Nations scholar, I've experienced and know the violent origins of colonial power, and also know and see that another way of being exists and has done since time immemorial. The laws set up by the colonial powers became universalised by the debates between those powers and grew into contemporary international law. And they ignore those other ways, pre-colonial ways of being, ignored notwithstanding those ways still survive today, still under duress, but they nevertheless survive. The intent of colonialism was the death of our peoples, our identities, and our ancient names. Many have gone, but many have survived also. The imperialists mapped the world and translated the north as being at the top and the south at the bottom, creating a geographical hierarchy. We also know that a Euro-centred view of the world once took it to be flat. Interestingly, that our own old peoples have always known that the planet Earth was a sphere, a cyclical body of law and motion. So much for the very importance, the critical importance of Aboriginal knowledges and its positioning within the academy. Some see their world as the normative and other ways of knowing as strange. Our old people observed corks carrying fire sticks to ignite bush, to flush out prey. They observed the lighting of fire was for survival, for food, and that bird and human equally shared ways of being alive. We learnt fire stick farming from one of our relations, that relation being the Kiriki or the brown hawk in our language. For she and we are one in our sharing of life and knowledges. We learnt from each other. Evidence of our ways is found in our languages. How many words are there, for example, in any number of First Nations languages? I took this from a great Lakota philosopher, Russell Means, when he wrote, how many words are there in any number of First Nations languages which are used to describe a natural phenomena, clouds, for example? Some nations in the Lakota use as many as 52 words to describe a cloud. And this is while the English language has as many more words for killing, slaughter, torture, and many others that are related to violence. So ontological and epistemological differences are evident and can be located and found in language. So I see this as a future area of importance in terms of Aboriginal languages, keeping them alive, but also of how language informs our ontological and epistemological positioning in modern Australia. Similar deep knowledges of the relationship between people and the earth were once held in the places now known as Europe, but were lost and were now translated as myth, not real, not law, and having no real connection and relationships to other beings. And I've written, I have an article coming out in a forthcoming article in the Journal of Environment and Human Rights, where I write more closely about relationality and the human and the natural world. So my reading and in an approach to relationality of violence shared by oppressed peoples is, as I've said, rooted in colonialism. And that is a point of engagement and discussion, I think, for this seminar. To note our approach to the discussion of relationality is different, and that my focus here, and I'd put, without representing an Aboriginal First Nations, pan-Aboriginal First Nations view, but would put that our focus is relational in connection to the natural world and is distinctly different from some other focuses perhaps that may arise out of this seminar. Looking at decolonisation as an approach, as a possible action. What of decolonisation? And the aim to bring about the repatriation of Aboriginal life, land, and in such a way that is not simply just a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve Aboriginal lives and ways of being. I'm talking about decolonisation that is concrete and real in the lives of Aboriginal peoples today. Not just more of a chat show, not another decade of constitutional recognition, and God knows where the chat on treaty is likely to lead. But where's the action, where's the implementation part of it, that might move us beyond being locked into more talking about rights in an abstract, in the future kind of way that never seems to realise in the present. So what are the possibilities? To move beyond rights of another time that disappears into the neoliberal agendas of colonial states. The decolonisation project for Aboriginal lives is more than a civil and political quest for the human, but is also inclusive of all things of our Aboriginal worlds. The human part is not all. We need to, we need in that space of thinking relationally about the voice that's given to the land and to our water systems and to all other living beings in the natural world. The current approach is limited in a human-centric sort of rights discourse. We need to move on, and the time is critical, and all evidence shows, or all of the reasoning, that our ancestors have known forever and ever and ever that we are all related, and that our natural ecosystems are as important as we are as the human. So while all bodies matter, we need to think beyond the body of the human to the body of the earth. Places as Aboriginal peoples, we have relationships and obligations to care for. We theorise our worlds more than ethnography, seeing humanity as beyond man, human as subject, and this is also what I've written about in some of my writings. Black universals, or the idea of there being one, is a creation of colonialism itself. For example, white supremacy as justification for the colonial project in the application of terra nullius doctrine of discovery, as justifications for the theft of land from First Peoples, or progress narratives and the exploitation of the human to advance the project progress, have a universal application by way of race as a justification for imperialism, while peoples of colours are transformed and become objects of the neoliberal project itself. Aboriginal peoples have always had an understanding of who we are in the world, not limited by what it means to be human, but who you are, where you come from, who your relations are, and all to mean what it means to be Tanganakaud, Miantank and Bowendik, as of myself, as of my own being, that I stand here today in the place of my grandfather's, my grandmother's place, my grandfather being of the Watchabullock peoples. Now within the colonial matrix, we perform constructed and imposed colonial identities, a historic process of colonialism, terra nullius being native, British, subject, Australian citizen, native titled persona, all performed within a colonising hierarchy. So what does it mean to be Aboriginal? How do we be who we are? How do Aboriginal knowledges that we carry still, even though for many they are remnant pieces post the genocidal history of colonial settlement? So how might we have a useful discussion here today so as to advance our understandings of colonialism and contribute to decolonisation without the world being sabotaged by other agendas unrelated to our knowledges of being Aboriginal? I'm simply talking about the Aboriginal space here. So how might we be and stand our ground in our own beingness? To do this, we need to escape the matrix of colonialism and realise the horizon and the space of our own Aboriginal being. That is, in the words of Dennis Walker, of Bloodlines Back to Country, knowing where and how to stand with the laws of the land of the ancestral relations. Many Aboriginal people have never stopped being, even though we are made invisible for our resistance and deployed by the colonial project as being something else, either mad, sick, criminal or too airy-fairy, etc., etc. So, as to related oppressions, while there are deep connections between different forms of oppression and obliteration of our humanness, our relational connections to the world we live in centre our approach and move away from seeking sameness and or difference. So to determine how it is we stand where we stand, what those relationships are as determined through the ways of our ancestors, it is from a decolonised centre that we might speak properly to each other about colonial violence and how it has been a tool to silence the voices of those violated. We can see then who has the loudest voice and the content spoken by those loud voices when speaking to the colonial state in its address and attempt to silence the not so loud voices. Many of us Aboriginal people across this continent are pretty familiar with that process. What kinds of hierarchies emerge from the loud voices, the unheard voices in the competition to be heard? Is there a colonial pragmatism to the establishment of a hierarchy of voice? And we saw this in the 1960s in the name of the UN's established decolonisation process. And we might ask the question of who got in and who got left out. Who got left out were First Nations peoples from the decolonisation process. And it was based upon the colonial pragmatism of a theory that the US come up with, but blamed the Belgians and called the Belgium thesis or the Blue Water thesis, which fundamentally meant that those who got left out of the decolonisation process were Aboriginal peoples who'd been colonised in the Americas, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Australia and in Canada, based on the Blue Water thesis, which I won't elaborate upon, but simply that all of the other countries, the Africa, the Asian continents, were included in the process of decolonisation and enabled or not disabled in the same way that the Blue Water thesis had disabled the process from applying to First Nations peoples. That is, that there was no sea of water that divided the colonial state from the colonised subjects. So for the African and Asian states, colonisation was a different experience. Well, the decolonisation process was deemed to occur. They remained colonised, however, they remained colonised by a neoliberal imperialist rule of governance and law, while economic power was retained by colonial constructs of a decolonised authority. So again, it was a decolonisation within a colonial framework of the UN body itself. In effect, remained colonial in many ways imagined. So how might we connect to those who are now deemed decolonised, yet Indigenous, as they have been decategorised as colonised? More recently, we've seen the US depart on another recent event, the US departure from the UN Human Rights Council. And a point of interest to myself as an advocate in this space is to look at the, without delving into the tantrum, Trump's tantrum, and for all of the different reasons he departed from that council, I was interested in thinking about the UN Human Rights Agenda, Council's agenda, and how, while tortuous, there's a permanent item on that council's agenda which was set in the 1940s, 1960s, which still remains today, regarding the Palestinian state, and was due largely, it's a permanent item which sits on the council's agenda. And what I'm advocating for, that in the same way, as tortuous as a process or could be argued a useless process, but nevertheless, I say that in terms of solidarity of the oppressed, why isn't the question of Aboriginal peoples' right to self-determination a permanent item on the UN Human Rights Council's agenda, which would have effect and a resonance for Aboriginal peoples across the planet? This is not to take anything away from the struggle of the Palestinians and the urgency, the critical urgency that item remain. I'm also not naive enough to see that there would be an immediate response. I mean, that item has been on the council's agenda for many years, and it sits there. But I think that it's important that it sit there just as such an item regarding Aboriginal people's rights to self-determination sit there as well. I've run out of time, and I won't labour this point anymore, other than there may be some questions that perhaps I could answer about, well, we've got UNDRIP and doesn't that cover it? Well, no, it doesn't, but I'm happy to engage further and give advice or respond to those questions. But I set that by way of an example of some of the differences and where we need to ensure that that the discourse around Aboriginal peoples understand that it's not a human rights issue, it's an issue about the rights of peoples to self-determination. And in the meanwhile, Aboriginal peoples across this country still stand in that space of our own Aboriginal being and our right to self-determination, and I'm so glad that we're still doing that after 200 years of the most oppressive, genocidal power and force to obliterate that space of standing. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I want to start with an epigraph that I've been using as a guide quote in terms of thinking about this project, and it's from Afro-Canadian writer Dion Brand's text, A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging. And she writes, to have one's belonging lodged in metaphor is voluptuous intrigue, to inhabit a trope, to be a kind of fiction. To live in the Black diaspora is, I think, to live as a fiction, a creation of empires and also a self-creation. And I'm taking this, bless you, this idea of what it means to live as a fiction quite literally. I'm not quite sure that that's how Brand intended it, but to really think about both the creation of empires and a self-creation and the necessity of that within what I'm calling Black life. Black life is that which must be constitutively abjected, and as such has represented the negative ontological ground for the Western order of things for the last 500 years. But it cannot be included in the Western world of man as such. And as an ontological formation, Black life not only forms a part of the modern West, but must be understood as constitutive of this domain. The Middle Passage, transatlantic racial slavery, the plantation system, and the gendered racial terror erected on Black people were not one-time events. And I think this very much echoes what Irene was saying about colonization not being a one-time event and not being something that is over, right? They spanned almost 500 years from the early 15th century well into the 19th century, and we can still feel the reverberations of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization in many places around the globe, in Australia, on continental Africa, among many other places. The subjugation, expropriation, enslavement, rape, and killing of Black life continues today under different guises in, among other places, the prison industrial complex in the United States and the economic neocolonization of many African nations by the West and other forces. Given this historical sedimentation, Blackness and Black life have become the negative fleshly foil for the being of white Western man. Nevertheless, Black life is continually made to appear as mere ontic scaffolding vis-a-vis the world of man. That is, as historical happenstance rather than as a force that fundamentally structures every part of being in the world of man. And what I'm trying to do overall in this project is to read Blackness and what I'm calling Black life as a mattering force that is not only something that is located within human beings and within culture, but sort of traverses all these different fields. And I'll talk about some of them in the talk today. I should also say, though, that Black life cannot be reduced to anti-Black racism, even though it provides the ontological conditions of possibility for the historical or ontic existence of Black people, Black diasporas, Black culture, and whiteness and modernity writ large. As a result, focusing only on the ontic leaves intact the structural basis for racial slavery, Jim Crow, neocolonial exploitation, and the prison industrial complex. Put somewhat differently and more simply, we have to understand that we are still in a world in which, in order for individual Black lives to be recognized as suitably human by the law and other Western forces, their Blackness must be killed, right? That they can survive as humans or as quasi-humans, but not our Blackness. Continuing the exploration of Hortense Spiller's notion of the flesh and Sylvia Wynter's consideration of modern humanity in Habeas Viscus, my talk today focuses on Black life, Schwarzsein, as a constitutive ontological limit for the workings of modern life and being. And for Spillers, the iconic thickness of what she calls the flesh, both opposed to the body and parasitic relationship to it, represents the pivotal domain to which man marks the hierarchical species-level difference between himself and his various others. For instance, indigenous populations, Latino, poor, incarcerated, disabled, gender non-conforming subjects, but especially African-descended populations. To say it more succinctly, and in the words of Hortense Spillers, Black is not merely vestibular to culture, but also to life and being in the prison house of modernity. And if indeed the flesh supplies the constitutive relation to the world and thus to the earth, then we do well to recall Amiri Baraka, who in the 1960s said that Black was neither a nation nor chained to particular territories, but a country. Black is a country. That is, we ought to insist, and not a nation state, but a country. We ought to insist on the flesh as a country as the enfolded mattering of the ungendered belonging to unbelonging. This is kind of my mantra, the enfolded mattering of the ungendered belonging to unbelonging. As a result, it becomes tantamount to understand and amplify alternate modes of being that do not rest on abjuring Black life, but embrace its manifold possibilities, albeit without erasing the traces of violence that give rise to them. As a concept, for me, the flesh, following Spillers and others, conjures mattering movements in Black that resolutely defy the purely biocentric, precisely because of its complicated histories within colonialism and many other places. At the same time, the flesh provides openings for different formings and matterings beyond both man and the human. That is, the ungendered flesh of Black life represents a series of mattering praxes of Black livingness, of how we be human. These alternate modes of being represent inhabitations of the flesh that bring to light the relational being in the world of Black life, in the process making the constitutive ungendered displacement of Black life from origin and belonging habitable in the present and in the future, by staging the affectability, this is a very long sentence, of Black ontological mattering as second sight, as one of the most luminous gifts Black life has bestowed upon our world. In focusing on the affectability of Black, and I'm cutting out a part where I discuss Denise de Silva's concept of affectability in greater length. My aim is to highlight the different ways the histories of Schwarzsein offer an archive of alternatives to being in the world of man in the vein suggested by Toni Cade Bambara. Namely, and I'm quoting here from Toni Cade Bambara, the terrifying and overwhelming possibility that there are no models that we shall have to create from scratch, and as a result effectively stand in the flesh as both the fiction of empires and as self-creations. The larger project that this is from, I'm currently imagining it as structured as a form, as an alternate form or an alternate periodic system, meaning that there are different elements of Black life that is modeled after the more canonical or hegemonic periodic system, but is also completely different from it. And I'll read a few parts of the entries of elements from Black life. The first one is walls, bathrooms, these parts. One of the many ways in which the putatively natural difference between man and his Black others becomes legible is through what Spillers refers to as the ungendering and defacing project of African persons. Accordingly, the genders and sexualities of Black life are deemed incompatible with the world of man because Black subjects are projected to be either in possession of a surplus of gender and sexuality or a complete lack thereof. As Spiller says it, the unsexed Black female and the supersexed Black female embody the very same vice, cast the very same shadow, since both are an exaggeration of the use to which sex might be put, end quote. That is, the histories of racial slavery, colonialism, Jim Crow, the prison regime, etc., and so on, have congealed to debilitate Black subjects' ability to conform to normative genders and sexualities. And I always like to use this as an illustration. This is from the heyday of segregation in the U.S. South. And insofar that there were actually restrooms for non-white people, for Black people, which there weren't in many cases, they were not gender segregated, right? And I think that given the current moment where so much of the struggle for trans visibility and trans rights is around the questions of bathrooms, I think that this sort of gains a different kind of resonance, so to speak. And it also architecturally highlights the violence that Spillers associates with this idea of ungendering. The iconography of these restroom signs underscore this disavowal of gender difference in no uncertain terms. We might call this, riffing off of Dion Brand and Spillers, the vestibule to the ungendering of the door of no return. Nevertheless, Spiller's notion of ungendering does not imagine black people to be completely devoid of gender differentiation, which is why she does not use the phrases non-gendered, degendered, or state that black people are differently gendered or gendered otherwise than white folks. Instead, ungendering highlights the continuous brutal processes of negating the gendering, what disability scholars Nirmala Araveles in her analysis of Spillers calls the impairment of black folks via their juxtaposition to properly, quote unquote, human gender codes. And my point is here in raising these questions that this, again, as with the self-creation and a creation of empires, that this represents a certain violent imposition, but also a series of possibilities for imagining and living gender and sexuality otherwise. As in the example of Toni Cade Bambara again, who asks us, and this is from an essay that was included in her anthology, The Black Woman from 1970, who asks us to let go of all notions of manhood and femininity and concentrate on blackhood. And then she continues, I'm not arguing the denial of manhood or womanhood, but rather shifting of priorities, a call for selfhood, for blackhood. And to put all of this dense stuff a little bit more in a little bit more concrete terms, what I'm suggesting here and what several other studies of black genders and sexualities have been thinking and talking about is what if we imagine black not only as a racial designator, but also a designator of gender and sexuality, right? And my point is that the shifting of priorities that Bambara demands with regard to the effectability of black ungendering already exists in a variety of guises. And we ought to consult the histories, myths, speculations in order to embrace more fully the gift of Schwarzsein's non-normative modes of being and becoming. And I'm not going to go into some of the examples that I discuss in the longer version of this, but just to give you a concrete example, black queer science fiction writer Samuel Delany has a novel from the 1980s, Stars in My Pocket, Like Grains of Sand, where one part is set on a planet where neither gender nor sexuality are fixed identities, but are apportioned momentarily in relationship to who and what the being, whether they're human or part of an alien species, desire, right? So that gender and sexuality move with the desires of the beings. And I also discuss Afro-Scottish novelist and poet Jackie Kay's novel Trumpet, about a black trans man in Scotland in the 1960s at greater length. And Jackie Kay writes about this perpetual state of vestibular unbelonging in a poem from her 1999 collection Off Color entitled Somebody Else. And she says here, if I was not myself, I would be somebody else, but actually I am somebody else. I've been somebody else all my life. It is no laughing matter going about the place all the time being somebody else. People mistake you, you mistake yourself. Black life wades in the swamps of perpetual necessary self-reincarnation in spaces that resolutely deny its existence by demanding that black folks be somebody else, anybody else. And here, let me just play you a clip of Kay reading this poem and the poem that I'll talk about for a bit.
This poem came out of a number of different occasions where people seem to think that being black and being Scottish is a contradiction in terms. So things like that are always happening. Like very recently in Wigtown, I was with my mum, and she referred to me as her daughter, and this little lady said, "Is that lady your daughter?" My mum said yes, and she went, "Oh, your daughter's awful tanned. Is she that colour every day?" So I've had lots of instances of that kind of thing. So I thought I'd write this little poem, In My Country. In my country, walking by the waters, down where an honest river shakes hands with the sea, a woman walked round me in a slow, watchful circle, as if I were a superstition or the worst dregs of her imagination. So when she finally spoke, her words spliced into bars of an old wheel, a segment of air. Where do you come from? Here, I said. Here. These parts. Somebody else.
As a black person in Scotland, Kay is an interloper, always already undone, unfinished. And her response to these incessant questions to her and her mother is, as we heard, the poem In My Country. Here, I said, these parts. It seems as though in this particular constellation, the existential question, where do you come from, gains a double signification, since it's not only presupposes that Kay as a black person cannot form a part of her mother, but a part of Scotland's imaginary bloodlines. And this highlights, and this is one of the main points that I'm working through here, and this idea of belonging to unbelonging, how indigeneity rarely, not never, in the Western mode of thought and being, rarely ever applies to blackness, given that settler colonialism must position blackness and indigeneity as relationally opposed in order for whiteness to remain the norm and to ensure the killability of black and native populations in very, very different ways. The mattering of blackness thus takes on the shape of always already being anti-indigenous to what Kay calls these parts, the belonging to unbelonging. And I'm really just thinking through this. And one of the examples that I want to work through here, and that I think that would sort of provide a good way to concretely think about the relational histories of not only blackness and indigeneity, but sort of look at different spaces, is the black babies that were born to black military fathers and white German mothers in the aftermath of World War II. And in relationship to what happened in Australia during the stolen generations and what happened with boarding schools and residential schools and in North America with various native populations. And so the story is that there were a number of black German children born in the aftermath of World War I. A lot of them were sterilized during the Nazi regime, and then there were about in an 8-year period about 3,000 black children born, as I said, to black GIs and white German mothers, and there was a lot of complex legal wrangling about unwed mothers not actually having rights to their children, etc., and so on. And there were a lot of moral panics about these children. And one of the things that happened was that two black American women, one in Germany and one in the United States, noticed this and started a what was then called a brown babies adoption plan, which meant that about 20 to 25% of those children, many of whom were in orphanages, were adopted to black parents in the United States and in Germany, right? So the thinking was that these children having black adoptive parents would be better for them than either being wards of the state in Germany or existing in white Germany. But what this did as a result is that it basically wiped out a whole generation of black Germans existing as black Germans, right? So that there are all these different kind of levels to it, and I'm still thinking through what that what that meant. But I mean, more concretely, what that meant for folks like myself who came of age in the 1980s is basically that we had to start from scratch, right? But because there was not a generation that had organized in the earlier period as black Germans, or even defined themselves as black Germans, and to bring this back to Jackie Kay, that this seems to me a very, very one more time, a very violent way of imposing that these children, many of whom also were not told that they were adopted, and then found out in their 50s and 60s that they had been they had been adopted, but the imposition of having to be somebody else, right? Because they could not belong to what Kay calls these parts, in this case meaning Germany. So I'm still mulling through that, and I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion period. The next section is called Blood. When asked by interviewer Richard Goldstein in 1984 what he would say to a gay man on the threshold of publicly declaring his sexuality, James Baldwin responds thus: "Coming out means publicly say, I guess I'm imposing these terms on you." He's a perceptive one, the Richard Goldstein there. And Baldwin's response is, "They're not my terms, but what advice can you possibly give?" The best advice I ever got was an old friend of mine, a black friend, who said that you have to go the way your blood beats. If you don't live the only life you have, you won't live some other life. You won't live any life at all. And that's the only advice you can give anybody. And it's not advice, it's an observation, end quote. Surely we can read Baldwin's statement as a version of just be yourself. However, Baldwin's summoning of the enfleshed viscerality associated with traveling the rhythmic paths paved by your blood should not go unnoticed here, particularly in light of Baldwin's statement being taken up by a number of black queer writers since its publication. And there's a whole sort of section on blood and imaginary bloodlines in Jackie Kay's novel Trumpet, and the other text that I look at is Joel Gomez's 1980s black, indigenous, lesbian vampire novel, the Gilda Stories. But more concretely, in book titles such as Go the Way Your Blood Beats, an anthology of lesbian gay fiction by African-American writers, or Ernest Hardy's 2 volumes of cultural criticism, Blood Beats Volume 1 and Volume 2. Given that black cultures, particularly black queer cultures, have resisted equating kinship with mere consanguinity, Baldwin and others' invocation of blood initially appears to invoke something akin to biological inscriptions of black queerness. Yet if we think about blood not as a permanently fixed cosanguine essence, but as relationally affectable mattering, it becomes difficult to cast off this plasmic fabric of Schwarzsein. That is, Baldwin and the others simultaneously conjure and metamorphose the enfleshed intensity of blood, whether individual or familial, biological or adoptive, quote unquote. While adhering to some form, some other life is tantamount to not living at all, as Baldwin reminds us. In black life, moving in accordance with the idiosyncratic pathways of your blood, the way your blood pulses facilitates an intimate knowledge of all the time being somebody else. Maybe this is what W. Du Bois had in mind when he prophesied in 1903 that Negro blood has a message for the world. And the next section, which I think, well, I'll read some of it, is cells, the cellular. And it's about Henrietta Lacks and a different part of Henrietta Lacks's story. While most of you are now familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks and the eternal afterlife of the HeLa cells and their productive vestibularity for so many fields of science and industry, what has garnered far less attention is how the cervical cancer cells, the first human cell culture to exist independently of their human form in the laboratory of a poor black woman from Virginia, and it should also be said that this was done without her permission or her family's permission, and for many years the family did not know and did not benefit from this, and they still to some extent do not. But how her cells, her cancer cells, shaped the first complete genetic map of the human genome. 20 years before the sequencing through the Human Genome Project, another sequence was completed in 1981 in the UK, albeit not using nuclear DNA, the 46 chromosomes found in the nucleus, but mitochondrial DNA. The primary difference between these two forms of biological mattering lies in the fact that mitochondrial DNA is transmitted to succeeding generations only through the maternal line. And there's a lot more here to be said about the human genome and the Human Genome Diversity Project and how it imagines race, and especially blackness and indigeneity, but I will not. What later came to be known as the Anderson or Cambridge sequence served as the reference for both the Human Genome Project and the Human Genome Diversity Project. Oh. And that's Henrietta Lacks. At some point in the process, it was revealed that against the grain of previous suppositions, because the sequence was completed in Cambridge, that this map had been tainted by bovine and Gila specimens, and thus did not consist of purely melanin deficient genetic material, i.e. the assumption was that it was only European/British mtDNA. Once this knowledge became public, Anderson Cambridge was resequenced in 1999 with the scientists correcting the map to conform to the Euro norm, thus excising not only Gila cells, but any trace of perceived Africanity. I guess this is what happens when the family of man meets the door of no return. What does the somebody elseness of Henrietta Lacks' genetic material, the continued beating of her blood in the afterlife, communicate to our world? As an altogether difference of creating bloodlines ex nihilo, the retroactive transformation of the sequence into a white British human, nobody else, highlights that we are not dealing with mere absence, but with the continued violent killing and erasure of Black life by any means necessary. As a result, Black life must be expunged from even the purportedly most fundamental parts of human life in order for it to begin to resemble human life. Whether this occurs on the street, in the boardroom, in the university, or in the laboratory. What we see here is the continuous violent unblackening of human life. And then the other part of this is that once it became known that the Gila cells were taken from a Black woman, the narrative around it was that her cells aggressively displaced all other cells that it came into contact with, and that her cells procreated prolifically. As I used to have in this text, but I excised, you really can't make this shit up. You just can't. So that they were kind of humanized, but of course also sexualized and to a certain extent ungendered in very, very specific types of ways. And then the next section is B with the subscript 2, and that will make sense in a second, hopefully. We have no choice but to remain in the force field of death and the rhythmic incantations of the flesh. In his philosophy of being, Martin Heidegger deploys the term Dasein, which in German signifies a mode of being rather than subjectivity or individuality. And he expressly does this with the purpose, at least initially, of not collapsing being and the human. Dasein denotes the sphere of being that establishes beings and things as individuated entities. As Denise Ferreira da Silva remarks, Heidegger's version of phenomenology, the writing of the being of man as the human in the world, that resolves exteriority into interiority, space into time, by enveloping the whole domain of existence as the moment of Dasein, or the being whose particularity resides in the fact that it asks the question of being that is concerned with what and who we are, with what and who we are, end quote. Still, Heidegger differentiates between man's capacity for world forming, the animal's poverty in world, and this is Heidegger's terminology, and the absolute worldlessness of the stone. So it's a tiered and hierarchical relationship to being, to Dasein. This tiered distinction between humans, animals, and minerals comes into existence primarily through the different ways, according to Heidegger, these entities relate to mortality. Writing, death is the ownmost possibility of Dasein. Being towards it discloses to Dasein its own most potentiality of being, in which it is concerned about the being of Dasein absolutely. The own most possibility is non-relational. This non-relational finality of death or finitude in Heidegger's phrasing creates a self-reflexivity for the individual, unconcealing to them that they are not only a particular being, but also form a part of the ontological sphere of Dasein. The profound familiarity with one's own possible worldly demise leads to an authentic recognition of Dasein, which also constitutes man's ability to form world. And it should come as no surprise that the Jew, quote unquote, and the Negro are the exceptions beyond animals and minerals. Remaining in the clearing of being towards death, Heidegger argues that in contradistinction to man's own death, we do not experience the dying of others in a genuine sense. We're at best always just there too. So even as man's genuine encounter with the potentiality of his or her own mortality grants them entry into the sphere of Dasein, the death of others is not something that man can experience, at least not authentically. I'm left pondering, what if in all the hard work of having to be somebody else in these parts, we cannot but experience relationally the death of others, because that death is also our own most mortality. Put differently, what might all this mean for Black life's relationship to death? Or in Saidiya Hartman's formulation, the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead. And I'm reading lives here not only as human lives, but the lives of the lives of the dead of a number of other factors, such as cultures, languages, landscapes, names, genders, origins, belongings, and so on. That these lives of the dead are what partially constitutes, and the relational relationship to it, Black life and Schwarzsein. I'm asking how our over-acquaintance with not only the dead per se, but the lives of the dead can form the basis for an ontology of Schwarzsein. If to exist in the Black diaspora is to live as a fiction, the eternal return of being somebody else, then it represents an ontological fabrication produced by the mattering of the enduring vitalities of the dearly departed in our Black lives. And for those, and I'm quoting here intermittently from Edward Glissant and his Poetics of Relation, for those beings to be not being, for those who do not have recourse to that which would pre-exist relation, i.e. the vacuity of being as being. So he's counterposing a kind of ontological relation versus this idea of being, as espoused by Heidegger and others. It becomes impracticable to not apprehend the lives of the dead as mattering absences that continue to structure the own most potentiality of being Black, of Schwarzsein. As Jackie Kay writes in her novel Trumpet, and this is said by a character who migrates to Scotland from an unnamed African country in the early part of the 20th century, writing, "My own country is lost to me now, more or less all of it, drowned at sea in the dead of a dark, dark night," end quote. Where else but to go where your blood beats when you've got no place to call home in the dead of the dark, dark night, and making generations is not an option because you've always already lost your mother, your language, your gender, your sexuality, your religion, etc., and so on. And I use the term Schwarzsein to inject some much needed Black studies and melanin into Heidegger, but also more importantly for me because it's the translation for the English language term blackness as it circulates in German academic and activist circles, because there is no word for blackness in German, and this is what folks have used for about 20 years now. Moreover, in strict opposition to the majority of German words in the German language, which are strictly gendered, the door is feminine, and the table is masculine, for instance, it's qualified by the gender-neutral das Schwarzsein, das Dasein. And I want the passage from Dasein to Schwarzsein to play an important role in theorizing the ontological dimensions of ungendering in Black life as the enfolded mattering to belonging to unbelonging. And I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to talk through this next section. And this is sort of, it riffs off of Heidegger and Sylvia Wynter when she asked, how do we be human? And what I do is, the B with the subscript, the non-finite B, is one of the grammatical hallmarks of African-American vernacular English, and it usually indicates something that is done repeatedly and habitually. Of course, oftentimes in the mainstream imagination, it is just imagined as something, as a mistake, so to speak, right? And this is how Wynter uses it there, right? And what I'm doing is sort of reading that as a kind of linguistic manifestation of the ontology of Black life. And riffing off of, or engaging with June Jordan, who talks about there also not being a passive voice in Black American English, and this idea that the presence of life governs all of Black English. And bless you. Thus, the B2 and the overall necessary ontological vivacity of African-American vernacular English provide linguistic instantiations of Black life, just as Schwarzsein modifies and envelops the Heideggerian notion of Dasein. They represent the enfleshed somebody elseness of Dasein. Ultimately, while we can certainly dispute, oh, this is completely messed up, so, whether the Negro identifies being with life, more precisely with the vital force, because his metaphysics are an existentialist ontology, as Leopold Sédar Senghor would have it. It would be a shame to not underscore that Black life Schwarzsein epitomizes an ontology written and lived in the blood as the relational, ungendered mattering of the living flesh, which traverses the human and non-human, the biological, the cultural, of how we be hybridly human, to riff on Sylvia Wynter. Thank you. That's it.